Long ago, before this day's confusion did begin, throughout the stars did we go wandering. Distance was no barrier, and time it had no hold. Free to come and free to go. Free to come and free to go. Open up the book of stars. Open up the
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Karmic Evolution's Astrologically Speaking. I'm your host, Sherry Horn Hassan of Karmic Evolution Astrology, and I'm coming to you on April 14th, 2023 from Contact Talk Radio. Just a quick reminder that this show aims to bring you the truth about astrology and your soul's karmic evolution. First, as usual, my usual housekeeping stuff, which is to tell you can listen to this podcast anytime simply by going to my website at karmicevolution.com, clicking on the upper right-hand banner that's labeled podcast. And from there you can scroll down the page, hear the most recent show, and or search the archived listings for any past shows that you might have missed or to which you'd like to listen again. And just another reminder that the show drops every Friday now at 11 a.m. Pacific and 2 p.m. Eastern, so you can listen then or you can listen anytime. And while you're there on karmicevolution.com, you'll see above the most recently posted show recording a downloadable freebie labeled How to Keep Your Sun Sign Happy. And that's friendly advice for every sun sign from renowned evolutionary astrologer Stephen Forrest about what each of us, depending on our individual sun sign, actually needs to be happy. It's kind of a little nutshell thing. Anyway, it's based on an interview I did with Steve a couple of years ago, and he's given me permission to distribute it more widely as a PDF as a means of promoting the validity of astrology in our lives. And yes, it will sign you up for my weekly Conversations About Consciousness astrology newsletter, but you can, of course, unsubscribe anytime. So be sure to grab it when you listen to this podcast, whether you do so when it drops or after the fact, and enjoy some astrological words of wisdom from Stephen Forrest. Separately, you can always follow me on my Facebook page, which is Karmic Evolution for Your Soul, and that's where you can keep track of upcoming podcast content if you're not signed up for the newsletter, and other astro news you can use. I'm also posting now on Instagram under karmic.evolution, so feel free to follow me there as well. Thanks. Okay, and finally, I'm offering now my discounted 75-minute Karmic Evolution Natal Insight reading for only $125 to podcast listeners only. So if you're interested in astrology and want to learn more about the true meaning of your individual birth chart, in order to gain greater consciousness about your soul's true mission and purpose in this lifetime, and you'd like to move from chaos to clarity about whatever might be holding you back now from achieving your most cherished desires in whatever area is of greatest interest to you, your relationships, your career, your job, your finances, your health, then this is the reading for you. We'll look at how the energies into which you entered this lifetime, or chose to be born, as we say, may be keeping you stuck in old habitual patterns, or what I call soul-conditioned behavior, and how this knowledge can assist you to make different, more positive choices moving forward. So if you'd like to co-create your own future happiness through astrological insight, it's really very easy when you take advantage of this special discounted offer, and you can find it at karmicevolution.com/karmic125. As I like to say, conscious awareness has never been so easy or so affordable. All right, so let's get into this week's astro news you can use. I've been thinking a lot, and, I've mentioned this like just maybe a couple of small times in the past, about Pluto's transit through Capricorn and the U.S. Pluto return, which technically began when transiting Pluto hit 26 degrees and 33 minutes of Capricorn, which it did on November 20th of 2022. And that was a degree short of the U.S. Sibley chart's 27:33-minute Pluto in Capricorn, heralded the potential recurrence of energies from the past, many of which have been surfacing over this past year or two, if not more. So what occurred leading up to Pluto, when it did hit itself in the U.S. Sibley chart, which is July 4th, 1776 at 5:10 p.m. in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, what occurred leading up to that point was the Declaration of Independence by the 13 American colonies. Independence from whom? From the British monarchy. Now, just an aside note, I've mentioned this before too, but many astrologers, but not all, consider this Sibley chart, which is named for the man who constructed it, to represent the symbolic birth of America as an independent nation. So bear in mind now, and I'm sure most of you know this, but it's just a little review, that Pluto moves very slowly and has an orbital path that doesn't move through all 12 zodiacal signs evenly. In other words, Pluto's orbital path doesn't lie in the same plane as the other 8 planets. And yes, most of us astrologers still consider Pluto a planet, even though he was downgraded in 2006 to a dwarf planet, but that's another discussion for another time. But so Pluto doesn't move through the same plane as the other 8 planets, but rather he's inclined at an angle of 17 degrees, which makes his orbit more oval-shaped or elliptical than the other planets. So, for example, Pluto moved into Capricorn circa January 26th of 2008 for 15 years until he dipped his toe recently into Aquarius on March 23rd of this year, 2023. Now, Pluto spent even less time in Sagittarius, 13 years I think it was, and less time in Scorpio, more like 12 years, and so on. And so he's moving into the period where now that he's done 15 years in Capricorn, he'll do 20 years in Aquarius and at least 20, if not more, in Pisces. Now, I'm not going to be here when, I don't know, I'll be here maybe when he goes into Pisces, yeah, in 2044. But, I might not know it. Anyway, so those of you who are much younger, of course you will be here. So, but for the next, so the point is that Pluto's moving into its longest part of its elliptical orbit in terms of his journey through the 12 zodiacal signs. Now, something else most of you probably know, but I won't make the assumption, is that Pluto's ingress into Capricorn, and that was, of course, back around January 26th of 2008, heralded the U.S. banking crisis, which resulted in mortgage defaults and millions of people losing their homes. And since then, too, we've seen the rise of corporate power due to governmental big bank bailouts and the subsequent practices of rewarding CEOs and other higher top management of corporations and institutions such as banks, not solely, but oil companies and other major companies, Monsanto and places like that. And so we've seen the rise of corporate power because these large corporations, specifically the banks, after 2008, were bailed out. And even though the banks had made mistakes in their lending practices, banks and other financial institutions, CEOs were rewarded, and stock owners and shareholders were rewarded, and that was at the expense of the little guy. So it began when banks and financial institutions, which negligently approved mortgages, what they called subpar mortgages at the time, were assisted through government largesse, but individual homeowners received no governmental assistance to help them escape default on their bad loans or from having to sell their homes for less than they paid for them originally. They were underwater. Many of us remember short sales where you sold the house for less than you paid for it. And most people who hadn't paid off their mortgage yet didn't have a lot of equity in their home, so they lost money. But since then, also, and I'm still talking about Pluto's journey through Capricorn, the Supreme Court ruled on Citizens United, which was a landmark decision by the court, argued in 2009 and decided in 2010, so pretty early in the Pluto-Capricorn journey, regarding campaign finance laws and free speech under the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. And the court held 5-4 in a 5-4 decision that the free speech clause of the First Amendment prohibits the government from restricting independent expenditures for political campaigns by corporations, including nonprofit corporations, labor unions, and other associations. Now, this was heavily naysayed and also ridiculed at the time by many who said that the Supreme Court had decided that corporations and individuals were equally protected by the U.S. Constitution under the law, and therefore an entire corporation and an individual such as you or I have the same rights. And that right included contributing monies to political candidates running for office. Now, while at the time Senator Mitch McConnell commended the decision, arguing that it represented, and here I quote, an important step in the direction of restoring the First Amendment rights, former President Barack Obama stated that the decision, and here I quote him, gives the special interests and their lobbyists even more power in Washington. In other words, power that makes those special interests and lobbyists tantamount, as I said, to you or me under the law. So, why am I telling you all this? Well, it's that just as Pluto's move into Capricorn back in 2008 of January heralded a 15-year period of corporate dominance over individuals, Pluto's ingress into Aquarius now will move us from Capricorn-themed capitalism and its transformative rise in power to Aquarian egalitarianism, or the belief in the equality of all people, especially in political, social, or economic life. And that will last until Pluto enters Pisces for the long haul, as I mentioned before, in January of 2044. And hopefully I'll still be here. Anyway, and that's a long time, right? Especially for those of us, again, I will speak for myself, who aren't getting any younger. Now, Pluto is always connected to transformation because of its archetypal themes of death and rebirth. And it represents the evolutionary forces within society because it's an outer planet and therefore connected to more subliminally unconscious energies. Pluto in the Roman mythology, Hades in Greek, were the gods of the underworld, and it was Carl Jung in the advent of depth psychology that correlated Pluto with the unconscious or the subconscious, what's going on behind our conscious mind, behind what our ego can see, feel, touch, smell, and taste, and so might not believe it exists, right? So what's going on inside of us all collectively at any given moment in time or any particular era in society will be reflected back to us through events outside of us. That's the Hermes Trismegistus. I always get it wrong, so forgive my pronunciation. The mantra, or the slogan, or the sentence: as above, so below; as within, so without; as the universe, so the soul. All right. The point of that is that what happens outside of us, above us, without, or in the universe, in the soul, from our soul, coming from our soul, is reflected from what's coming out of us that's below our consciousness, that's without our consciousness, or that's embedded in our soul, but not in our ego's conscious portion of our psyche, right? So Pluto is also associated, which most people know too, with taboos and all things hidden. meaning trapped below consciousness, right? If it's hidden, you can't see it, taste it, feel it, touch it, hear it, whatever, then you're not necessarily going to believe it exists. So if it's trapped below consciousness or in the realm of our unconscious where it's denied and repressed, and remember, this isn't always, it's not like it's not like it's, okay, this is going to sound funny, right? It's not like it's conscious, right? You're not consciously denying it. You're not consciously repressing it. It's your unconscious that's repressing it. And so the more unconscious denial and repression we give to any particular taboo subject, the more we project that out and draw it to us. So what was projected out while Pluto was going through Capricorn came in the form of the belief in success at all costs, or because remember, Capricorn is ruled by Saturn. Saturn's about success. It's about our reputation out in the world. It's about business, and that's why it has a correlation with corporations and capitalism, right? So what was projected out, as I said, is the belief in success at all costs. That's the main goal. Or in the end always justifies the means type of way. So this is like, the corporate shills, I guess I'll say, who would say, well, who cares if our chemicals poison the environment and people die of cancer or lung disease or whatever other ailment they may develop. We're making money. Yay! So it's the modern day equivalent that we just went through with Pluto and Capricorn, as he's already in Aquarius, he's going to retrograde back into Capricorn again twice before he re-enters Aquarius for the next 20 years in November of 2024. But it's the modern day equivalent of what led up to the French Revolution's famously callous quote, which is often attributed to Marie Antoinette, when and the quote was about letting the starving poor people with no money to buy bread to just let them eat cake. Now, there are multiple examples of Pluto and Capricorn shift into the ruthless and callous, uncaring for the average person, and major signs that society favored those who stand to profit personally from the sale of whatever goods or services they manufactured or supply. And if we hark back again to the last quarter of the 1700s or the 18th century in this country, we can see that objections to goods made in Britain and carrying heavy tax burdens for colonists, tea, anyone, suffered major objections and sparked an eventual revolution. And that's especially since that tax money directly supported the crown, rather than being repurposed into American infrastructure and local businesses to help this fledgling economy. So last week, when we experienced the April 5th and 6th Libra full moon opposing the Aries sun, wounded healer Chiron, and the expansive yet potentially hubristic Jupiter in Mars-ruled Aries, which likes to fight for a cause, the moon reflected the light of the sun back to us, revealing how independent-oriented Aries arrogantly tried to expand its power. Now, this was precisely what the Tennessee legislature did when it chose to expel 3 lawmakers, 1 white and 2 black, from its legislative body because they had interrupted legislative business to protest Tennessee's inability to pass gun regulations in the wake of the recent tragic school shooting in Nashville that left 3 children and 3 adults dead. That the vote failed to expel the white lawmaker, but did expel the 2 young black lawmakers, only served to highlight the extreme level of hubristic, prejudicial arrogance of this body located in the state that gave rise to the Ku Klux Klan. So in essence, as we morph from Pluto and Capricorn to Pluto and Aquarius right now, what's being exposed, what's coming to the surface, like, Mitchell Lewis, when he was on the show in the past, he likens it to a boil, right, on the skin that's coming to the surface that needs to be popped so all the pus can come out. And as disgusting a metaphor as that is, it's apt because this is Pluto, right? So, once we expose the boil, pop the boil, we can then go through the healing process and come back to normal. So what's being exposed now is the extreme narcissistic nature of a capitalist society where legislatures are bought and sold by corporate interests. And since it's the Senate that has to approve Supreme Court justices onto the highest court in the land, most of these senators receive what's known now as dark money or money without a named source. They too, meaning the senators, become beholden to organizations or corporations that work behind the scenes to influence them, to help appoint or not appoint, refuse to appoint judges. So the rigid restrictions attempted while Pluto transited Capricorn are going to die, but they're not dead yet. And right now, especially since the Chiron Sun Jupiter in Aries stellium was prominent this past week, I talked a lot about it last week, stuff like let's build a wall to keep the Mexican rapists out, or let's get rid of all the non-white legislators, or let's keep gerrymandering local districts and keep the GOP, the majority ruling class, is coincidentally being exposed almost seemingly all at once, right? So it's no accident, too, that Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas was this week front page news again, this time for taking quote-unquote bribes from billionaire Harlan Crow, a guy who likes to collect Nazi memorabilia and has statues of dictators in his backyard, in the form of vacations and other trips for him and his election-denying, always Trumper wife, Ginny. Now, some of these vacation jaunts would have cost them $500,000 had they paid for it themselves. And just yesterday, it was revealed by ProPublica that Thomas, who was on the deed, apparently, along with his brother and mother to his mother's house, sold her house to guess who? This same billionaire Crow. Now, allegedly, Crow, quote-unquote, spruced it up quite a bit, and Thomas's mother lives there still. Now, Crow also reportedly bought several other properties in that neighborhood, seemingly to fix them up and make them a nicer neighborhood for Clarence Thomas's mother to reside in. Or so that's what appears to be the case, especially since Thomas has not yet, if ever he will, answered any questions about this. But here's the real kicker. Just as Thomas did not disclose his billionaire paid-for trips, which he says he's not bound to do because he was told years ago that he didn't have to, because he didn't have to declare gifts from friends that were hospitality, meaning like, your neighbors come over for dinner and bring you a bottle of wine, you don't have to declare it. So he's saying that his $500,000 vacation jaunts with his friend, billionaire Harlan Crow, came under the heading of hospitality and didn't need to be disclosed, right? Which he would otherwise be bound to do. But actually the law was changed, I don't know if it was this year or last year. So now the justices do have to declare certain things that are deemed hospitality. But up until last year, he did not. And he has many years of these trips, etc. So he also did not disclose the real estate sale to Crow. Now, at this recording, Thomas, again, wasn't responding to any press questions, but some in Congress are beginning to take note and get antsy about finding out the facts, which might lead, theoretically at least, to some kind of ethics rules, since the Supreme Court justices are the only U.S. judges not bound by a code of ethics currently. So there's a huge amount of pressure with all of these revelations coming out, particularly focused on Clarence Thomas, that is showing us the kind of corruption that's coming out as Pluto's ending its transit through Capricorn. And, this did start a while back. It's not like it's all coming out now, but there was now, I don't know if it was like maybe 2 years ago, or a little less, that it seems like to me it might have started when the Special Interest National Rifle Association, along with its lobbyists, were exposed as having actually written some of the pro-gun legislation passed by the state of Florida a while back. And yesterday as well, another piece of, restrictive rigidity by the minority over the majority came from the Florida legislature, which, despite the fact that a majority of Floridians are opposed to it, the bill that was passed shortens the ban on abortion from up to 15 weeks to now only 6 weeks. And I don't think most of us have to be told that most women don't even know they're pregnant by 6 weeks, right? So again, a part of this Chiron, Sun, and Jupiter and Aries stellium that was highlighted at the Libra full moon has revealed part of the wounded nature of our government. Jupiter itself has many different archetypal themes, but one of them is justice, one of them is morals, one of them is ethics, and those are the things that contribute to our whole entire, stack of laws. I said this last week, thou shalt not kill, right? It's a law. And then society decides at different times what the punishment for that will be, because as we know, in a democracy at least, the punishment can change. But this wounded nature of our government is particularly obvious when legislative bodies, be they on the federal level or state levels, represent a minority of the population in that state because of things like gerrymandering, which is rigged redistricting, that favors conservatives over liberals. And, I'd add as well something I've spoken about several times. I spoke a few weeks ago about it pretty much at length, which is that Jupiter-Neptune conjunction, I'm like hooked into it, in Pisces that occurred on April 12th of 2022, or a year ago. And I'd already compared it to the last time that these two conjoined in Pisces, which was in 1856, to the current spawning of the big lie about the election in 2020 and other hoaxes. And I noted the recurrence of the use of the word hoax, which was also in use back in the mid-1850s at the rise of spiritualism and seances and people talking to spirits, some of whom were revealed to be fakes, right? And again, I had said on my show that many of us understand that the veil between the worlds is thin and that we can communicate with spirits. But what we're talking here about is something that gripped the collective psyche to such a degree that people allowed themselves to be deceived. So yes, there are a lot of legitimate people who practice spiritualism and practice it now. But back then, it seemed to take hold and kind of be like flow on a wave of its own, right? So, again, there's that. And the other thing, if we're looking at the backdrop, is that, the other outer planet is Uranus in Taurus. And this is important because Mercury's going to station retrograde on April 21st in Taurus. And while it's moving through Taurus and Uranus is moving through Taurus, the dispositor, meaning the planet that rules the sign that another planet is transiting through, that's called a dispositor, is Venus. So we got a lot of Venus action going on here. And when you boil it all down, Venus is relationship, but Venus is really about beauty, love, and harmony. But it really when we're talking about Taurus, because Venus, of course, rules Libra, which is the social side of relationships, and Taurus rules the physical part of relationships, then we're talking about what we value. And what we tend to value most is what pleases our senses, one of our 5 senses. And that, again, is something that the ego can be very aware of, right? So while we focus on what we want because it makes us feel good, we can also, and this is especially as Pluto moved through the Earth sign Capricorn, and we've just experienced the Libra full moon, and the wounded Jupiter and Sun, it can be exposed through venally arrogant individuals who become greedy for power, money, and domination. And any doubt about that, I think, can be assuaged by the memes going around Facebook now asking why a man like Donald Trump needs to raise funds from the likes of you and I, or you and me, if he's already a billionaire, right? Now, I think that a lot of this became extremely obvious just recently when first partnership-oriented goddess asteroid Juno, who's the wife of Jupiter in Roman mythology, and Hera is the wife of Zeus in Greek mythology, conjoined with changemaker Uranus and Taurus on April 10th. And I wrote in my newsletter earlier this week that this signaled, quote, potential revelations about current alliances that change how we value these relationships. So we could look at what I just said, things like, okay, why does a billionaire need all this money if he's such a billionaire? Oh, okay, why do we have a Supreme Court justice who I may not really have cared one way or the other about, but who now I'm hearing had this alliance with this billionaire, and that maybe he wasn't being ethical about revealing what he's supposed to, because as one of the highest Supreme Court justices, the highest court of the land, is supposed to be honest and ethical and moral, right? All right. And what happened this past week, because I like to look back before I go forward, is that Venus entered Gemini, and that happened right after Juno conjoined Uranus, and that Venus entrance into Gemini was late on April 10th or early on the 11th, depending on your time zone. But almost immediately within a couple hours, Venus formed an Aries trine to Pluto and Aquarius. And again, I wrote, quote, how such revelations, based on the Juno-Uranus revelations, about our partners, may increase our emotional intensity and deepen insights about our relationships now. So all we need to do, I think, is look back to that Tennessee legislature's vote to expel these 3 lawmakers and watch how it increased their solidarity, what we have come to call the Tennessee Three, as it was obvious that Gloria Johnson, Justin Jones, and Justin Pearson never broke ranks. And what happened to the 3 of them brought them closer together in a very intensely emotional way. So if you're looking for an example of how an aspect works, there you go. And that in turn inspired the people they represent, who clearly ended up objecting to the legislature's move. So by the time Venus trined Pluto early on April 11th, Justin Jones had been reinstated by representatives of the district that had originally elected him. And he was actually reinstated on the early evening of April 10th. So we could see that brewing, and you can see it's a good example of how aspects can manifest when they're waxing, not just at their exact, the moment they make the exact aspect. But, again, we were, of course, also under the auspices of the Aries Sun-Jupiter conjunction, which perfected late on April 11th. So this conjunction, which I also explained in my newsletter, where both planets were within 17 minutes of arc, is what astrologers call cazimi, a term used to refer to planets that are so closely conjoined that they're considered in the heart of the sun. And this had the effect, according to ancient astrologers, of strengthening the energy of these 2 planets together, or put another way, of making them into energetic superheroes. So in its most spiritually esoteric sense, Jupiter represents higher, read expanded consciousness. And as both the Aries Sun and Jupiter separated from wounded healer Chiron and are separating now, we're asked to reevaluate where past wounds have dashed our belief in optimism and faith, and how now we may resurrect a new sense of faith that leads to future healing. And meanwhile, but a large part of my point of going into the backdrop of Pluto and Capricorn coming to an end, but still not completely over, is that this is corresponding. This is supposed to be one of the most fortuitous aspects ever. The Sun and Jupiter coming together, and this time in Aries. They do this every year, so this is not unusual. However, it's my opinion that the addition of Chiron to that stellium is what is boiled over as part of the Pluto and Capricorn revealing of the crap and all the dirt and all the, corruption underneath, particularly related to business and particularly related to ethics, morals, and the law. So now when the Capricorn moon went on to form a third quarter cardinal square to the Aries Sun, which was on April 13th, we were called between then and the Aries New Moon solar eclipse next week on April 19th or 20th, again, depending on your time zone, to reorient, right? This is the third quarter waning square of the monthly lunar cycle. And we have to push ourselves to reinforce our faith in the belief that our wounded sense of justice can and will be healed. But what that Sun Jupiter also revealed to us, based on the things that I was just talking about, is other people's arrogance and hubris. So, but healing our sense of justice, whether it's collectively or personally, is especially true for any of us who've lost faith or hope that, because, or we've lost faith or hope at the hands of those who've overstepped their bounds and used their desire for power, and Jupiter, of course, is, after all, the king of the gods, for personal gain only. So this Sun-Jupiter cazimi pointed out also our ability to recognize that those who've gotten too hubristically big for their britches may need to be taken down a peg or two and curtailed. And therefore, this recent cazimi reminds those in powerful positions that the sky is not the limit anymore. In fact, it conjures images of the archetypal story, and that of arrogantly trying to fly too close to the sun, and how that's only going to result in getting your wings burned and plummeting you back down to earth. So, coincidentally, or perhaps I should say paradoxically, while the Aries Sun-Jupiter cazimi conjunction exponentially expanded the egos of some, which made us notice it because you couldn't not notice it, and exposed their grabs for power exponentially as well, it also allowed us to see what was going on beneath the surface, again, Pluto and Capricorn, and as he morphs into Aquarius, and be able to recognize such arrogance and such corruption. So, what happens too is that with the third quarter waning cardinal square of the Capricorn moon to the Aries Sun on April 13th, we know that that is a time to take action. The first quarter square is an action time. The third quarter square is we're waning. Now, Venus in Gemini's mutable square to Saturn in Pisces April 14th also helps us reevaluate our relationships and to view them from a more sober quid pro quo standpoint. That's going on now, or is just perfected. This opportunity to see more clearly if and where any relationships work more in others' favor than our own means we can then take the necessary actions to rectify this by better balancing the scales. And that leads to some questions we might ask ourselves now. Am I getting as good as I'm giving, or is this relationship imbalanced? How can I express myself clearly now and explain what I want and what I need to bring greater fairness and balance into my relationships now? And is this particular partnership too imbalanced to continue? So the point of the Venus-Saturn square is to make us aware that relationships require a solid foundation of trust, that both partners will commit to holding up their end of the bargain, and that periodically this bargain may need to be renegotiated. So seriously imbalanced partnerships may end now as a result of such reevaluation, while stronger ones will become more solid for the future. And as always, where Saturn is concerned, anyone or anything that leaves our life now, especially at a Venus-Saturn square, creates the space to then be filled with a new partner or partners who will bring more equality into our relationships and thus increase the chances of long-term trust, commitment, and satisfaction. So as all this corruption is revealed and starts to come to a head, things like the call for a Supreme Court justice to be impeached or to actually take the action of resigning, which is probably 99.99999% not going to happen. And even if he was impeached, it probably wouldn't work because of the GOP-dominated House. But we can ask ourselves also whether or not we choose to be dominated by the will of the minority over the majority. And if we do nothing, will we regret it later? So it's as this monthly lunar cycle wanes that we begin to become aware that there's a second Aries new moon coming, and that the second Aries new moon is on April 20th or 19/20th, like I said, is also a solar eclipse, which means it carries certain thematic messages for us. But most importantly, this second Aries new moon, which follows the one from March 21st at 0 degrees Aries, this one is at 29 degrees of Aries, so one was at the very beginning and this one is at the very end. These two Aries new moons in a row symbolize that universal powers presumably have deemed it necessary to repeat planting seeds that will blossom into taking some kind of action. Now, what's interesting, and I've said this before, but I don't expect anyone to remember it, is that there are several very well-known, renowned astrologers, some of whom have written books on the subject, who talk about the fact that the theme of any eclipse starts to emerge in your life or through the collective beginning about 3 weeks before. So I know this is interesting because this series of eclipses, which are happening on April 20th and then on May 16th, I think it is that the eclipses come in series and they repeat each other every 19 years. So the last time this eclipse happened at this degree was in 2004. So you might want to check back to what was happening then in your life. But here's how Bernadette Brady, who wrote Predictive Astrology, The Eagle and the Lark, and she categorized all of these eclipses. Well, this is a quote from her. It says that the energies of this particular eclipse on April 20th and the next one in May range, quote, from sudden sexual passions and lust to birth and procreative drives. This series is not subtle and can catch people off guard and confront them with their own very deep passion, which may have been hidden for many years. Now, I think if you just take the example of some of the things we've been talking about, sexual passions and lust, what's been on the radar for the last 2-3 weeks? The former president of the United States was arraigned, which means he was arrested on charges of hush money paid to a porn star. And he also paid hush money to a girlfriend who was a former Playboy bunny. And Karen McDougal was her name. And he also paid $30,000 to a doorman who was trying to sell a story. And I think this was a few years before the other two, which were right before his election, that Trump had fathered an illegitimate child. Nobody seems to have come up with any proof of that. But, you know, there's that. And when this says birth and procreative drives, and I just read to you spoke to you about Florida, and we're all aware. The other thing that happened yesterday and the day before is, or this past week, right, was that the judge in Texas, the real conservative Trump-appointed judge, had put a stay on mifepristone for a week, and the DOJ has now appealed that, and the appeal won a stay, which means that the Fifth Circuit Appellate Court, which is made up of 3 judges, 2 Trump-appointed and 1 not, ruled that the injunction, or whatever it's called, against the distribution of mifepristone, or the prescribing of it, would not hold for the time being because the case is being appealed to the Supreme Court. So you can still get mifepristone. However, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals said that it cannot come by mail. So in other words, you have to go pick it up at your pharmacy. Presumably, you can't have it through telehealth. I'm not sure exactly of the details of that. But, you know, we're seeing, I was thinking that Venus is in Gemini now, right? Until May 7th. So, you know, Venus is women and the feminine divine and all that stuff. And Gemini made me think immediately of the post office, right? Nothing shall stay these couriers, not rain, nor sleet, nor snow, nor doom of night. And so Venus is squaring Saturn, and I think that also has something to do with this judgment. So the story's not quite over yet, but you can still, for the time being, get mifepristone as long as it's not through the mail. And that will extend, I believe, beyond the judges saying that his ruling would go into effect by Saturday night. That is no longer the case, if I'm not mistaken, as we'll be able to, anyone will be able to get it. You just probably have to get the prescription from your doctor and, as I said, go to the pharmacy. I guess you could have it delivered, you know, from your local pharmacy. I don't know. It's not the mail, so, you know, I don't know. I really don't. But, I mean, these are the kinds of things that lawyers ponder for days and hours and weeks. Anyway, I thought it worth the mention that, of course, Mercury is stationing retrograde the day after this solar eclipse, but the solar eclipse is also going to be squaring Pluto, right? So if the luminaries are at, hang on a second, the luminaries are at 29 degrees and 50 minutes of Aries, and Pluto is going to be on April 20th by East Coast time at 0 degrees 19 minutes of Aquarius. So they're less than 30 minutes away from perfecting their squares to Pluto. So that is both the sun and the moon in square to Pluto is an energy of confrontation. It's an energy of pushback. It's an energy because Pluto is a societal planet and it has to do with societal reform. That, you know, we're in this period where Pluto's Capricorn and Aquarius, and Capricorn and Aquarius. And so we're seeing, as I've said in past podcasts, we're seeing the throwback to when Saturn went back and forth, and that occurred during the Black Lives Matter movement, during the crackdown by police and other authorities on peaceful protesters. However, there was also some violence and some looting and things like that, you know, causing mayhem, which gave the authorities and people in positions of power what they thought was the right to crack down on them. And then they included the peaceful protesters. My son has 2 friends up in Boston who were thrown into a police van for a couple of hours because they were, you know, peacefully protesting or whatever. So anyway, many of us have younger kids or grandkids or whatever who are in high school and college. We look at these young people going to the state legislatures like down in Tennessee, and also for the abortion issue, you know, out on the streets, out on the state capitol steps, and they're protesting. This is the bellwether and the foreshadow of Pluto in Aquarius. So we're going to go back and forth, like I keep saying, between this restrictive, old money, minority rule, the corporations are everything and you're nothing, until we get to the more egalitarian long-term transit of Pluto through Aquarius. So let me see, hold on a second, I just want to give you the dates for the Mercury in Taurus retrograde. So Mercury stations retrograde at 15 degrees and 37 minutes of Taurus on April 21st, as I said, and he will move all the way back to 5 degrees and 51 minutes of Taurus and station direct again on May 14th, which is, of course, Mother's Day. Well, at least here in the States. So again, since Venus is Taurus, which Venus is the dispositor of Mercury when Mercury is transiting through the sign of Venus-ruled Taurus, represents the archetypal symbol of self-value, self-worth, and self-esteem. It increases our focus, the Mercury retrograde period in Taurus, on that which needs review now. Well, I'm sorry, I'm misspeaking. It increases our focus on the fact that what needs review now is where any past resistance to change has actually wounded us, and where allowing changed future decisions and actions to occur may benefit us more now. Now remember again, Uranus is also disposited by Venus as he's transiting long-term through the sign of Taurus, and he's been showing us rapid changes in our values. The most obvious example of that is that the pandemic happened during this transit, and that more people now work from home than ever before, and that is completely acceptable for a lot of companies who would have objected vociferously to it before, right? So these are the kinds of things. But of course, and I mentioned a long time ago, changes in our food supply and changes in things that we consider luxuries and things of that nature have all changed now and decreased our ability perhaps to bring ourselves pleasure, depending on what we're talking about specifically. But it's just a value change, pure and simple. So as we go through Mercury's retrograde in Taurus, we're going to be looking at the resources in our lives, and we're going to evaluate and review whether we still need the same resources or whether there are things we want to let go of, or to make, let go of something and make space for something else. Like what's important to us at a particular stage in life is not necessarily important as we move to another place, or we get another job, or we change careers, or we get married, or we have children, or we get older, plain and simple, right? So now is the time, with all of this going on, with the back and forth of Pluto and Capricorn and Pluto at Aquarius, where we're going to move from the power of the corporations to the power of the people. And in doing so, we might give some very deep thought during this earthy Mercury retrograde, and as part of the in the short term, the solar eclipse that is squaring Pluto, where we will put up the fight, where we will resist. And again, Pluto is right now in Aquarius. I think we've already been seeing that. Again, the themes of these eclipses happen ahead of time, about 3 weeks, 2 weeks, 1 week, which we're at now. So we're looking at people getting off the couch, getting out of their car, joining groups, right, and protesting. And protesting for what? For equality and for the right, for example, not to be afraid to go to school because you might die that day. I'm preaching to the choir, I'm sure, or at least I hope. So, I don't think I have to belabor that. And preaching, protesting that you can't make 50% or more of the American population second-class citizens, deny them bodily autonomy over, over their own health care, and deny them health care, period. So, these are two huge issues, since the largest cause of death of children now is guns. So again, I don't want to stay too long up on my soapbox. I just want to say that now is the time, with this second Aries New Moon solar eclipse coming, where we can look at what's just been occurring in this past couple of weeks, particularly this past week, and see all of this rot, corporate rot and greed and, business as usual crap that's influenced our justice system, and the greed and the power-hungry grabs for more money and to stay in positions of power, that we have to look at this as part of what has now become visible, and then take it to decide what issues we are most passionate about when the sun and the moon square Pluto, and how we're going to, what group we want to join. And of course, some of us are young, some of us are older, some of us are busy with families and elderly parents, or perhaps special needs children, or whatever. So we do what we can, right? And that's all anyone is asking. But recognize it now, because when Mercury goes into retrograde in Taurus, we want to be able to look at our lives and say, okay, what do I need? What do I truly, truly need? Not just what makes me feel good or what I desire, where can I say, all right, just like the quid pro quo happening in partnership with the Venus square Saturn, we're going to then look at what it is that we can kind of determine is most important to us in terms of the resources we need. Is it remodeling our house, or is it paying off our credit card debt? Because Venus, of course, has a correlation with Venus's Taurus rules the second house, and that's finances. It's also how we make our money, so it's related to work. So there's a lot that can be reviewed here, and I think that is going to benefit us all, but in the under the auspices of these bigger outer planet transits. So, one of the things I was saying is that Pluto in Aquarius, Pluto in Capricorn was about control and restriction, and Pluto in Aquarius is about power to the people. And so all of this judicial injustice, just to use one example, that's coming out at the end of Pluto in Capricorn is going to, as I said, drive people into groups, many of us who may have remained on the sidelines thus far, especially those concerned about women's rights to equality and bodily autonomy, and those who are concerned about children not having to do shooter drills every week or day in their schools, and so much more. All right. So that is it for this week. I think I've talked long enough. So thank you for joining me. I hope you enjoyed this podcast, and I hope you will all join me again next week on April, is it April 20th? No, 14th, 14th, 21st. Is that right? Hang on. I get confused now because I switched the show from one day, from Thursday to Friday. Yeah, on the 21st. And till then, may your, hold on, because I have my little set script and then I forget what it is. Oh, here it is. Okay. So I hope the information presented here has been helpful as you continue your karmic evolution in this lifetime. And I will see you next week on April 21st for another episode of Karmic Evolutions, Astrologically Speaking. Namaste.
Long ago, before this day's confusion did begin, throughout the stars did we go wandering. Distance was no barrier, and time it had no hope. Free to come and free to go. Free to come and free to go. Open up the book.